And simply say, no, there is another factor that affects judgments of the credibility of communicated information. One factor is the reliability of the speaker. The other factor is the believability of the content. And I think since I want to leave enough time for questions, I won't go into the Grice thing. Okay, so section 4 then, vigilance towards the content of communicated information. Now this is the thing that has been much less studied. I don't know of anything on developmental aspects of content, epistemic vigilance towards the content, but there are a lot of things you can say about it when you just, as it were, a priori, when you think about it. And here's a general line of argument. Some contents are obviously just intrinsically believable or unbelievable. For example, 8a and 8b. Someone says to you, every good book is a book. That's logically true, so it's bound to be true, and you don't need to worry who's asserting it to you, except it's totally irrelevant. Or 8b, no good book is a book. Well, that's internally contradictory, and again, you start wondering about the reliability of the speaker, but you wouldn't use the reliability of the speaker to judge the reliability of the content. But of course, most communicated information isn't logically true or inconsistent. You have to assess it for believability against a background of assumptions that you have stored in memory. You can assess it for consistency, where it would actually contradict something you already know, or you can assess it for coherence, where it's just made implausible evidentially by background information you have. And the worry is, well, you've got a vast amount of information stored in memory. You can't possibly check every utterance against the whole of your memory. That wouldn't make sense. Yet if you look at the philosophical work on coherence, which is coherence in belief revision, they're precisely talking about an offline process that could take a very great deal of time and would be very costly. They're talking about sort of scientific assessment of scientific credibility. What we need is an online method for assessing the credibility of communicated information. And here's the hypothesis that we've been pursuing from Sperber et al. 2010. The comprehension process itself, if you do it the way relevance theorists tell you to, provides an imperfect but cost-effective epistemic assessment. So the idea is this: if you're doing comprehension as relevance theory tells you to, but probably as most psychologists roughly would tell you to do, what you do is you access a very small, immediately accessible context of background assumptions, and you use that to see the implications of the utterance. According to relevance theory, you use it to derive contextual implications. You use it to see whether the utterance strengthens some existing assumption, or you use it to see whether the utterance contradicts and eliminates some existing assumption. And you're looking for enough cognitive effects of that type to make the utterance relevant in the expected way. So the idea is, okay, so understanding an utterance involves accessing a small context and performing some inferential steps, checking it against the context, looking for implications, contradictions, and strengthenings. So here's what Sperber and et al. Suggest. The search for a relevant interpretation, which is part and parcel of the comprehension process, automatically involves the making of inferences which may turn up inconsistencies or incoherences relevant to epistemic assessment. When such inconsistencies or incoherences occur, they trigger a procedure wholly dedicated to such assessment. So the idea is, in the course of comprehension, you're going to come across some inconsistencies or incoherences. Some of those can be automatically resolved as part of the comprehension process, and where you can't automatically resolve them, you hand them on to a separate process for assessing believability, and that's the epistemic vigilance process. So you can see that comprehension and acceptance are entwined. They're two processes that are looking at the utterance at the same time and trying to come up with a concrete result. So here are a couple of examples. So suppose you're interpreting an utterance and you hit a contradiction. Something in it contradicts something in your immediate context. And I'm going to consider three possibilities for resolving contradictions or incoherences in communicated information. The first possibility is you've been monitoring the speaker's reliability and you've decided the speaker is unreliable. In that case, the communicated information can be automatically rejected. It contradicts what you believe, but the speaker is unreliable, so you throw it away. And you end up understanding the utterance but not believing it. An example is that someone clearly drunk, comes up to you in the street and tells you, "I never get drunk." Well, you can see he's drunk, so he's unreliable, so you understand what he's saying, but you certainly don't believe him. So that's the first solution, and that could probably be done automatically. You could imagine a little procedure for unreliable speaker, content of information, contradicts background knowledge, reject communicated information. The second is the reverse type of case. If the speaker is regarded as quite reliable, and the background activated contextual assumptions are themselves rather weakly evidenced, then the background assumptions can simply be rejected or updated. They can be revised, yielding a new belief. So here's an example in 10. You happen to think from looking at Bill that he must be in his early 20s. And he comes up and tells you, "I'm 30 tomorrow." Well, people know how old they are, so that's a reliable speaker. In this case, it's contradicting something that you didn't have very strong evidence for. Again, you could just automatically imagine the old belief gets thrown away and the new belief replaces it, and the utterance is relevant as a result. But the really interesting case, and the case that I would like to think about much more then, is the third type of case. And this is the case where there's a genuine clash. You're confident both about the reliability of the speaker and about your own belief, which is quite strongly evidenced. So if you like, there's no automatic process that's going to solve this. You're going to have to look for more evidence. You're going to have to do some coherence checking. And so some sort of higher order belief revision is going to have to happen. An example is in 11. You thought Bill was a doctor. In fact, you thought pretty strongly that he was a doctor. Someone had told you he was. But Lucy tells you Bill is only 22 years old. And Lucy is always a reliable speaker. Well, what you know is that it's extremely unlikely that someone would be a doctor at the age of 22. So there you're going to have to, as it were, track back, both questioning the reliability of the speaker and the source of your own information, and come to some resolution. And the claim that we've been making is that whereas the first two types of contradiction can generally be resolved automatically, C typically involves some high-order reasoning process. And this is where things begin to get sort of quite complicated, because you get a feedback relation. Because if you look at the work that Mercier and Sperber have done, and there's a very nice article forthcoming in Behavioral and Brain Sciences called "Why Do Humans Reason?" They're pursuing a whole communicative or argumentative theory of reasoning. Their idea about reasoning, and they have very strong evidence for this because of certain types of fallacies that occur that need to be explained. Their idea is, look, reasoning isn't, as the philosophers have told us, just a tool for individual cognition. Reasoning is not there for us to sit in our armchairs and think about the nature of the universe. Reasoning is there precisely to enable speakers to persuade audiences by argumentation, and to enable audiences to defend themselves against malicious speakers by assessing precisely the believability of the content. So Mercier and Sperber in their work distinguish intuitive inference, which is the sort of thing that goes on subconsciously, subattentively, the sort of inference that goes on in spontaneous comprehension, and what they call reflective reasoning, which is a higher order process that involves thinking about evidential relations between propositions. And so the idea is some contradictions that you come across in understanding an utterance can be automatically resolved intuitively, but others involve higher order reasoning, and we need then to think about what the feedback effects of that are on comprehension. So the function of reasoning then, according to Mercier and Sperber, is essentially communicative. It's a tool for persuasion by speakers and epistemic vigilance by hearers. Now, this is the point where I think there are big implications for pragmatics. And if I knew what they were, I would be telling you. But this is luckily only a programmatic talk. But I do want to tell you some lines of argument. So in the last 10 minutes, I want to talk a little about how I see this project as developing. Something I haven't put on the handout, but I want to say here because I think it's quite important. If you look at the work of philosophers of language on pragmatics in general, at least philosophers of language outside the Gricean tradition, on comprehension in general, you get this incredibly skeptical attitude to pragmatics. Davidson, pragmatics can't be done. There's no such thing as pragmatics. It's a theory of the speaker and his relation to the universe. And, you know, there cannot be a theory of such a thing. It's sort of common sense, but you can't have a theory of common sense. You look at Fodor, he's heavily invested in saying, can't do pragmatics. Lots of things you can do in psychology, but pragmatics is too big. It's just a great morass of everything fitting together and no possible solution. Chomsky, not a philosopher of language, but not a pragmatist either. He will argue about anything in the world except pragmatics, which he thinks is sort of rubbish. Tyler Burge, and you can go on. Now, what's the reason for that? It's precisely because they think everything feeds into pragmatics. Everything feeds into comprehension. Pragmatics is a theory of everything, and you can't have a theory of everything. That's Chomsky's view. Now, the line that I have been sort of surreptitiously putting to you is the exact inverse of that. It's a massive modularity view. And what it says is, pragmatics isn't a theory of everything. And indeed, there's no such thing as central processes in general. When you look at these so-called general reasoning, it breaks down into lots of tiny little modules which interact with each other to produce a result. So what I've talked about today is a little comprehension module, which is geared to reading the minds of speakers. Pragmatics is, the goal of pragmatics is to attribute communicative intentions to speakers or informative intentions to speakers. That's fed by theory of mind reading in general, which is much more about assessing speakers as people, assessing their dispositions. Are they nice, nasty, what do they believe, and so on. That can feed the comprehension process, but it's a separate module. Then what I've been talking about with epistemic vigilance, I've been arguing that that's another module or set of dedicated mechanisms. So the idea is you've got lots of automatic mechanisms which you can isolate and study individually. You can look at how epistemic vigilance towards the source works. And you can actually break that down into epistemic vigilance towards the benevolence of the speaker versus epistemic vigilance towards the competence of the speaker. And that's the direction that developmental pragmatics has been going in recently. So what I'm saying is, yes, it's very complicated to see how epistemic vigilance interacts with comprehension, with mind reading, with person inferences, and so on, but it's manageable precisely because we can decompose the processes into isolatable individual processes, which we can then study separately. That's the bet. Of course, it may be totally wrong, and all those people who are skeptical about pragmatics may be right, but then what are we here at this conference for? We're here because we think pragmatics can be done. And I'm suggesting that maybe going in the massive modularity direction is a good way to go.